She was 22 years old, and the sum of everything she owned in the world fit inside a canvas satchel, no bigger than a feed bag. Her stepfather, Aldous Crow, a man who kept the town's only sawmill and ran it like a kingdom, had handed her that satchel on the morning after her mother's funeral and told her the house was no longer hers to occupy. He had said it the way a man says the weather is turning, not with cruelty exactly, but with a finality that made cruelty beside the point. She had $6 in a tin button box and a worn leather strap of wood-carving chisels that had belonged to her grandfather. And with 3 of those dollars, she would soon buy a padlocked grain house, sitting on a dead-end lot at the edge of a forgotten Missouri river town that nobody wanted and everyone had stopped talking about. It was a purchase born of cold desperation, but what she could not have known, what no one in that tired county knew, was that sealed inside that grain house was a 40-year-old secret, a deed chest, and a handwritten registry that held the truth about the man who had thrown her out. A truth that would not just save her life, but give back to an entire valley what had been quietly, methodically taken from it. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Vera Dunning. If you've ever been handed a door on your way out of somewhere you thought was home, leave us a word in the comments. You're not alone in that. Vera's education had not come from any schoolhouse. It had come from her grandfather, Emmett Dunning, who had been the finest furniture maker in 3 counties before his hands gave out and his heart followed shortly after. He had a shop behind the family house in Hannibal, Missouri, a low-ceilinged room that smelled of pine shavings and linseed oil, where the afternoon light came in sideways through a single deep-set window and lay itself across the workbench like something alive. From the time she was old enough to hold a mallet without dropping it, he had brought her in, not to watch, to work. He taught her the difference between a mortise and a tenon, not by drawing it on paper, but by having her cut both, wrong first, and then right, until her hands understood the distinction without her brain needing to explain it. He taught her to read grain the way a river pilot reads current. Not against it, but with it, following the wood's own intention rather than fighting it into a shape it didn't want to hold. A piece of wood remembers the tree it was, he told her once, his voice low and unhurried, the way it always was when he was teaching. He was planing a plank of walnut, the shavings curling up thin as paper. You push it too hard in the wrong direction, it splits. You go with it, patient and steady, and it'll give you something that lasts 100 years. She had her own set of tools by the time she was 15, chisels her grandfather had ground down from old blanks, handles he had shaped and fitted himself from hickory and ash. The finest of them was a narrow skew chisel with a handle worn dark and smooth from his years of use before hers. It fit her palm as though it had been made for it. In a way, it had. When she was 17, Emmett Dunning died in his chair beside the stove, quietly and without complaint, the way he had done everything. Her mother remarried within the year. Aldous Crow came with money, a large frame house on the edge of town, and opinions about what a girl ought to be doing with her time that did not include woodworking. The tools went into a trunk. The trunk went to the back of a closet, and Vera spent the next 5 years learning to be invisible in a house that did not want her to take up space. Her mother had been a gentle woman, not weak, but tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix. She had loved Vera genuinely and simply, and Vera had known it, but she had also loved the stability that Aldous brought, the not worrying about the roof and the coal bill, and somewhere in that bargain Vera had understood that she was the cost. She did not hold it against her mother. She simply understood. When her mother passed, a swift sickness, 3 weeks from first fever to final breath, Aldous did not wait. He was civil about it, which was almost worse than if he hadn't been. He sat across the kitchen table from her, the morning after the burial, folded his hands on the wood, and explained in even tones that the property had always been in his name, that her mother had understood the arrangement, and that Vera was welcome to take her personal belongings and make whatever arrangements suited her. He slid $6 in bills across the table. He had calculated, he said, a reasonable sum for her inconvenience. She looked at the money. She looked at his face, which was the face of a man who had been prepared for this conversation, and was relieved to find it going smoothly. There was no unkindness in it. There was simply nothing. No memory of her mother's name spoken warmly, no acknowledgement that she had lived in that house for 5 years, that she had cooked and cleaned and made herself agreeable to a man she had never chosen. She was a ledger item, and the ledger was being closed. "All right," she said. She took the money. She went to her room, packed her clothes and her mother's silver thimble, and, from the back of the closet, the canvas roll of her grandfather's chisels. She left the house without looking back at it. She was on the road by noon with a satchel, $6, and no idea where she was going. The answer came, as unlikely answers sometimes do, from an overheard conversation. She had taken the stage south along the river, not because she had a destination, but because it was moving. And movement felt safer than standing still. Two men in the seat ahead of her were talking in low voices about a place called Sallow Bend, a river town that had been a proper settlement once, back when the timber trade was running strong and had since contracted to almost nothing. The railroad had bypassed it, the mill had closed. Most of the families had packed up and gone. County's selling off the abandoned lots, one of the men said. Auction next week. Mostly old structures not worth salvaging. Anything move, the other asked. Couple parcels. There's a grain house nobody'll touch. Padlocked shut, county doesn't have the key, sold as is. They tried to get a price of $5 and couldn't get a bid. Vera stared out the window, at the river sliding past, gray, green, and wide, and felt something stir in her chest. Something small and cautious, like a flame being shielded from wind. She got off at the next crossroads and asked a farmer with an empty wagon if he was heading anywhere near Sallow Bend. He looked at her with the kind of expression that people in working clothes give to young women alone with a satchel. Not unkind, but measuring. Going right past it, he said. Nothing there to speak of, though. I know, she said. I'm meeting someone. She was not, but it got her a ride. Sallow Bend was less a town than a memory of one. The main street was a corridor of closed storefronts, with their windows gone to boards and their signs bleached to illegibility. A church with half its steeple missing. A feed store whose porch had rotted through and collapsed. Perhaps a dozen people still lived there, scattered in the remaining houses the way isolated trees stand after a forest has been cleared, surviving, but aware of what was gone. The county auction was held in the open lot, beside what had once been the post office. A clerk in a dusty coat read lot numbers from a manifest. There were perhaps 15 people present, most of them there for parcels of land, and they regarded each other with the wariness of men who know they are competing. The grain house came up near the end of the list. It was a structure built of heavy timber and board and batten siding, set on a stone foundation at the far end of the main street. Unlike most of the other buildings, it appeared substantially intact, its roof sound, its walls plumb, but its door was secured by a padlock that had been run through a heavy iron hasp, and, around the hasp, someone at some point had wrapped a thick chain and secured that with a second lock of a different make. The county, the clerk explained in a flat voice, did not have keys to either lock and was not responsible for any costs of entry. Sold as is, where is, contents unknown. He started the bidding at $5. Nobody moved, he dropped it to $4. He looked around the group. He was about to move on when Vera raised her hand. $3, she said. A few heads turned. The clerk looked at her with the patient expression of a man who has long since stopped being surprised by anything at an auction. $3, he repeated. Do I hear $3.50? He did not. Sold for $3 to the young woman in the brown coat. He marked it in his ledger. You'll need to handle removal yourself, miss. She walked to the table, counted out 3 of her 6 remaining dollars, and received a handwritten bill of sale in return. She was now the owner of a locked building she couldn't open in a town that barely existed, with $3 to her name. She put her hand flat against the grain house door. The wood was old but solid. She could feel the faint warmth the sun had put into it. She did not know what was inside. She knew only that it was hers. The first problem was not the locks. The first problem was shelter and water, without which she could not stay long enough to solve the locks. She explored what remained of Sallow Bend on foot that afternoon. Most of the houses were too far gone to be habitable. Floors collapsed, roofs open to the sky. But at the edge of the settlement, set slightly apart from the others, she found a small frame house that had fared better than the rest. Its roof was whole. One of its 2 rooms had a working stovepipe. The well in the yard, when she primed the old pump with water from her canteen, yielded cold, clean water after 3 minutes of working the handle. She had a place to sleep. Now she needed tools. Her grandfather's chisels were fine instruments, precise, balanced, the tools of a craftsman. They were not designed for forcing iron hardware. What she needed was something heavier. A cold chisel, a punch, a hammer with some mass behind it. She found the first piece of luck late that same afternoon. An older woman named Ruth Pell, spare and straight-backed, with the unhurried manner of someone who had long since stopped rushing, appeared at the house Vera had claimed, bearing a covered dish and a frank look of assessment. I saw you at the auction, Ruth said. You bought the grain house. I did. Ruth studied her for a moment. You know there are 2 locks on it. I counted them. Something shifted in the older woman's expression, not a smile exactly, but a slight relaxation around the eyes. My late husband was the smithy here when this was a going concern, she said. His shop is still standing, back of the house 2 lots over. I haven't opened it in 9 years, but the tools are there. Heavy stock. You're welcome to use what you need. Vera looked at her. Why? Ruth considered the question as though it deserved the consideration. Because I'm curious what's in that building, she said, and because you don't look like the kind of person who's going to cause trouble. It was as fair a reason as any. Thank you, Vera said. The smithy was dim and close and smelled of old iron and char. But the tools were good, hung on their pegs with the care of someone who had respected them, coated in a thin skin of rust that came off with a rag and some oil. A 3-pound hammer, a heavy drift punch, a cold chisel with a good temper, a pry bar. Vera carried them to the grain house the next morning and set to work. She was not trying to break the locks. That would have taken more force than she had. What she was doing, as her grandfather had taught her to do with any fastening that resisted, was studying the system, looking for where it was weakest. The locks themselves were hard and well made, the kind that would laugh at a chisel. But the hasp they were threaded through was another matter. It had been mounted to the wood of the door frame with square head screws, and those screws, after 40 years of weather cycling through the wood, had worked loose. The wood around them had swelled and shrunk, until the threads had nothing left to bite. She set the tip of the pry bar against the hasp's mounting plate and leaned her weight into it steadily. Without jerking, the way her grandfather had taught her to apply pressure to a stubborn joint. Slow, continuous, deliberate. The wood gave. The hasp pulled free of the doorframe with a tearing sound, both locks and all, and hung loose in the chain like a caught fish. It had taken her less than 10 minutes. She stood back and looked at the door, now free of everything that had been holding it, pushed it. It swung inward on hinges that complained bitterly but moved. A wave of air came out, old air, shut in, dry and dusty, carrying with it the smell of aged timber, and something underneath it, faint but distinct, the smell of paper, a lot of paper. She let it breathe for a few minutes. Then she stepped inside. The grain house was larger than it appeared from the street. The interior was one long room, with a board ceiling and narrow windows set high in the walls, all of them shuttered from the inside. The floor was swept, not recently, but swept at some point with intent, as though whoever last left had wanted to leave things orderly. Along the walls, on heavy shelving, were stacked wooden crates, sealed with their own lids nailed down. There must have been 30 of them. In the center of the room, on a plain wooden table, was a deed chest. A strong box built of iron strapping over heavy oak, fitted with a lock that would have cost more than most people earned in a month. It was the kind of chest that county courthouses kept, the kind that held documents that mattered. And beside it, as though placed there deliberately, was a leather satchel, collapsed and dry, its contents having long since settled into whatever shape they'd assumed. Vera unlatched it. Inside were papers, dozens of them, folded and stacked with care. On top was a single sheet, unsealed, in handwriting that had the controlled precision of someone who wrote for accuracy rather than flourish. To whoever finds this place and has the wit to come this far, my name is Josephine Carver. I was the land registrar for Dellard County from 1851 to 1873. What is in the chest beside this bag is the original land registry for the Sallow Bend River District. The true one, not the version that was filed in the county seat in the autumn of 1873. If you are reading this, enough time has passed that I no longer fear what Aldous Crow will do about it. He has either made good on what he took or he hasn't. I expect he hasn't. He never did have any intention of making good. See that the families are found. See that the record is corrected. The chest key is taped to the underside of the table. I have done what I could. Vera read the name twice. Aldous Crow, her stepfather. She sat down on the floor of the grain house because her legs had stopped working properly, and she read the letter again, slowly, from the beginning. What Josephine Carver had recorded, in careful, dated entries, with copies of the original deeds attached, was a systematic fraud. In the years leading up to the timber industry's collapse, Aldous Crow had been quietly buying county officials, altering land filings, and re-registering parcels that belonged to Sallow Bend's families under shell arrangements that ultimately resolved to his own holding company. When the timber trade failed and the families left, they had left believing their land was worthless and abandoned. What they had not known was that their land had already been stolen. First on paper, then in fact. Aldous had been quietly selling timber rights and mineral access from those parcels for decades, drawing income from land that had never been his to sell. The original deeds were in the chest. The corrected registry, Josephine Carver's true record, was in the satchel. The evidence was complete, painstaking, and devastating. A land registrar's meticulous notation against a man's entire constructed fortune. And that man had handed Vera $6 and closed his kitchen door on her. She sat in the grain house for a long time, the afternoon light working its way down through the high windows and moving across the floor. She read through the registry slowly, page by page. She recognized a few names, families she had heard mentioned in passing in Aldous' conversations over the years, names that had come up the way old debts come up, briefly and then not again. She found the entry for a family called the Dresslers, former mill workers who had owned 12 acres along the river. She found the Ganaway family, who had held a timber stand that would have been worth considerable money before it was cut. She found 8, 10, 14 families, their names written in Josephine Carver's clean hand alongside the parcels that had been taken from them. And at the bottom of one of the pages, added in a different hand and different ink, a note in the margin, in cramped letters. Most are gone to St. Louis or Jefferson City. Ganaway girl married a Pell, still in the county as of '89. Vera looked up from the paper. Ruth Pell, who had stood at her door with a covered dish and her late husband's tools. She went to find her. Ruth Pell heard the story the way certain people hear difficult things, without interrupting, without the face arranging itself into expressions of horror or disbelief. She sat at her kitchen table with her hands folded around her coffee cup and listened until Vera was done. "My husband's mother was a Ganaway," Ruth said at last. "She never talked about the land except to say it had been lost. I always thought she meant in the legal sense, debt, taxes, something like that." She paused. "You're saying it was taken. The original deed is in the chest," Vera said. "Josephine Carver's registry shows the transfer date and the name of the official crow paid to process it. There's a receipt in the satchel. He kept receipts, apparently, for his own records." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "That's the kind of man he is," she said. "He always thought the paper trail worked for him." She looked at Vera steadily. "What do you intend to do?" This was the question Vera had been asking herself since she sat down on the grain house floor. She thought of what her grandfather had told her about pressure, that a chisel forced straight into resistant grain would crack the wood, but worked along the grain, patient and sure, it would open it cleanly. Aldous Crow had lawyers. He had 40 years of constructed legitimacy. A 22-year-old woman with a satchel full of old papers, walking into a courthouse or a newspaper office, would be managed. She would be managed very efficiently. "The same thing Josephine Carver asked," Vera said. "Find the families. Give them back the record. Let them decide what to do with it." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, in the way of someone who has made a decision. "I know where the Dresslers went," she said. "I know a Ganaway cousin in Jefferson City. And the woman who runs the dry goods in Palmyra married a man whose father was on that list. I've heard her mention it." "Then we stood there," Vera said. "It was not fast work. It was the opposite of fast. But it was the kind of work that, once begun, built its own momentum. They went first to the Dressler family. A widow, in her 60s named Katha Dressler, and her son, who had built a life in a small town east of the river and received them with wariness that thawed slowly into something stunned, and then something else entirely. Something that looked like a man realizing a weight he had carried, for so long he'd stopped noticing it, had just been lifted from him. Vera did not begin with Aldous Crow's name. She began with Josephine Carver. She began with the original deed, which bore the Dressler name in clear ink, dated and witnessed, predating any of the altered filings by 3 years. "This is the record of what your family owned," she said. "And this," she placed the registry page beside it, "is the record of how it was taken, and by whom." Katha Dressler read both documents twice, her son reading over her shoulder. The room was very quiet. "My mother told us we'd lost it," Katha said finally. "She said the land office had made an error, and there was nothing to be done." "There wasn't," Vera said. "At the time, the man who made the error had made sure of that. What she left with them was not the originals. Those stayed in the grain house, which she had begun to think of as the archive, but clean, careful copies she had made herself, along with a letter from Ruth attesting to Vera's identity and the source of the documents. She also left a list of the other families on the registry, in case they knew of any. The Dresslers knew of 2. By the time she reached the 4th family, the story was ahead of her. A man at the door of a clapboard house on the edge of Jefferson City opened it before she could knock and said, "You're the woman from Sallow Bend." He had already heard. His brother-in-law had been at the Ganaway cousin's house when Vera had called, and word had traveled faster than she had. She handed him his family's deed copy and the registry page. He read it standing in the doorway and then invited her in for supper, which turned into 3 hours of careful conversation about what the documents might mean for the families, what legal options existed, who in the county might be sympathetic to a claim. She gave him the same answer she had given all of them. That was for them to decide. Her job was to make sure they had the record. Josephine Carver's job, 40 years ago, had been to make sure the record survived. Vera's job was to complete the transfer. She was not a lawyer. She was a woman with a dead registrar's meticulous files and her grandfather's chisel in her coat pocket, and that was enough. The news reached Aldous Crow the way that kind of news always travels. Not as a formal complaint, not as a legal summons, but as whisper and rumor carried on the ordinary movements of commerce. A freight hauler who had delivered goods to Jefferson City came back with a story. A county official mentioned something at a church supper. A lawyer in the county seat received 3 separate clients in a single week, all bearing copies of the same registry pages, all asking the same questions. Aldous Crow was a man who had built his position on paper, and he understood better than most how paper could be undone. He knew whose handwriting was in that registry. He had believed Josephine Carver's records had gone with her. She had died in 1891, and whatever she had kept in her private possession had not, as far as he knew, surfaced. He had believed himself safe in the way that men believe themselves safe when enough time has passed. He had not counted on a grain house. He had not counted on padlocks that were stronger than the wood they were mounted to. He had not counted on a girl who had learned to read the grain of things from a man who worked with his hands. There was no dramatic confrontation. There never is, with men like Aldous Crow. What there is instead is a slow erosion. Partners growing cautious, credit lines tightening, old alliances quietly dissolving as the people who had always known what he was began to sense that the knowledge was no longer private. The families who had been holding copies of those registry pages began to move through proper channels, slowly and with legal counsel, and the channels were more sympathetic than they might have been, because the original deeds were unimpeachable and the registry pages were in the hand of a county official with 22 years of service and a reputation no one had ever thought to question. Aldous Crow did not go to prison. The law of the time was not built to accommodate that outcome, and Vera had never expected it to be. What happened instead was that his holdings were challenged, his title to certain parcels was disputed, and in some cases invalidated, and the cost of defending himself across multiple jurisdictions consumed, over several years, most of what he had. He sold the big frame house. He moved away. He became, eventually, a man that people in Dillard County remembered the way they remembered old floods, as something that had caused damage and then receded, leaving the land changed but still there, still capable of growing things. Vera stayed in Sallow Bend. This was not a decision she made dramatically. It was more like a decision that made itself while she was busy with other things. She had the grain house, hers free and clear and larger than it looked, with Ruth Pell's help, and later, with the help of a young man named Tad Morrow, whose family's name appeared in the registry, and who turned out to have his father's talent for carpentry. She opened the shuttered windows, replaced the boards in the floor that had gone soft, and built a proper workbench along the south wall where the light came in best. She set up her grandfather's chisels on a board above the bench, each one in its place. It was not a furniture shop yet. For the first year, it was closer to an office. People came to sit across the table from her and look at their copies of the registry. To ask questions she often couldn't fully answer, but could point them towards someone who could. Ruth became a fixture, her knowledge of the county's families and histories an indispensable index. An older man named Percival Ames, a former schoolteacher who had stayed in Sallow Bend out of stubbornness and a fixed pension, contributed his careful penmanship to the copying of documents. But alongside that work, Vera built things. She built a set of shelves for the general store that had reopened in a smaller space 3 lots down. She repaired the church pews, which had warped badly over years of standing empty. She made a chest of drawers for Catha Dressler, who had moved back to the county after the dispute over her family's parcel was resolved in her favor, and who wept a little when she saw it, because the joinery was the same as the old country furniture she had grown up with and had not seen in decades. "Your grandfather taught you well," Ruth said one evening, watching Vera fit a mortise joint at the workbench. The light was golden and low, the shop full of the smell of cherry wood and sawdust. "He taught me to go with the grain," Vera said, without looking up. I've been doing that ever since. By the second year, people were calling on her for the woodwork first, and the document questions second. By the third year, the shelves at the back of the grainhouse workshop held a small inventory of finished pieces. A table, 4 chairs, a writing desk with dovetailed drawers, and there was a list of orders on a nail by the door. Sallow Bend was not Denver. It would never be. But it had a shop, and a church with fixed pews, and a school that had reopened, in a building that Tad Morrow had helped repair, and a community garden behind the old feed store that Ruth had organized with the practical efficiency of a woman who had always known how to make something from almost nothing, and it had Vera. She stood in the doorway of the grain house on a morning in early spring, a cup of coffee going warm in her hands, watching the river mist lift off the low ground at the edge of town. She could hear the rhythmic sound of Tad's hammer 3 lots down, where he was framing an addition to the schoolhouse. She could smell wood smoke from Ruth's chimney. On the workbench behind her, the deed chest sat in the corner where it had always sat. She hadn't moved it. Josephine Carver's satchel was folded neatly on top of it. The original registry and all its attachments were there, in case they were ever needed again. Beside the satchel, on a square of clean cloth, lay her grandfather's skew chisel, its handle worn dark with the years of his hand and then hers. She picked it up. The weight of it was the same as it had always been. The grain of the hickory handle ran smooth under her thumb, familiar in the way that few things in her life had been familiar. Emmett Dunning had taught her to make things that lasted. Josephine Carver had taught her, posthumously through her careful handwriting in a dry satchel, that record-keeping was a form of love. And Aldous Crow, who had handed her $6 and a door, had given her something he had not intended to, a reason to go somewhere, and $3 to spend when she got there. It was the best $3 she ever spent. Thank you for listening to this story of patience and quiet restoration. Sometimes what looks like a dead end is the only road that leads somewhere worth going. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needed to hear it today. And our question for you, has there ever been a moment in your life when something that felt like a loss turned out to be the thing that set you free? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.